Escaping from Eden, Chapter 5, Knowing in Our Bones. There was no doubt. They were human. The question wasn't what, but why. Why did these ancient Peruvians from more than 3 millennia ago have skulls that were 60% heavier than the average modern human skull? Why did their craniums have only one parietal plate instead of 2? Why were their brains 25% bigger? And why did their skulls recede so much farther back than probably yours or mine? The long skulls I'm referring to first surfaced on the southern coast of Peru, on the desert peninsula of Paracas in 1928, discovered by the archaeologist Julio Tello. At first, scientists believed the unusual skull shapes might have been the result of local cultural practices which used wooden boards and cloth bindings to reshape baby skulls. Practices of artificial cranial deformation were known in South America, as well as further afield in dynastic Egypt, among the Alemanni people of Germany, the Alan people of Iran, and the Andean Nazca people. Closer inspection revealed various clues in the skull's morphology and volume which indicated the unusual shape was in fact entirely natural. In other words, they were just another type of human being. The largest contingent yet found are the Peruvian long skulls. Others have been found in the Caucasus area in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So it is that our Paracan cousins provide us with another anomaly, another clue, and another discipline, indicating that the single-line story we have told ourselves about the evolution of human beings is not the whole story. What's the single-line story? That's the explanation you and I learned in school of the gradual improvement of hominins, beginning with Australopithecus, refining and refining until we reach us, Homo sapiens. Apparently, we just outcompeted every other subhuman genus because we are better. And hey, presto, modern civilization. Simple. One of my school textbooks described our arrival on the prehistoric scene. The image on the page, the artist's impression of us, stood out from the depictions of all the previous hominids. We, in the picture, were white and fit. The adjacent text amplified the picture in these words, quote, "All of a sudden, it happened. The group of Neanderthals was gathered around the fire. The men were working and talking about the hunt, the women scraping skins, the children playing. Unexpectedly, a cry, 100 cries, and then there appear, as if from nowhere, men of a different type, men who are tall, strong, handsome. Merciless men who spring to the attack. The Neanderthals don't even have the time to comprehend what is happening. A lethal rain of spears pours down upon them. The attackers leap forward to finish off the wounded, to capture and massacre the fugitives. As he fell, pierced by a spear far sharper than his own, he may have thought in his dismay that it was impossible to resist such an enemy. The horrified Neanderthals who managed to escape took refuge in the mountains where they were in time to perish of cold, hunger, and worse still, of loneliness." End quote. Homo sapiens had developed a state of perfection. He was now arriving majestically to take his place in the story of humanity. Man emerges, Mino Milani, T.R. May Hope, Pub. Tom Stacy. Wow, a state of perfection. Tall, strong, and handsome. And white. Handsome I may be. Tall and white? Not so much. So I guess that for me, the story didn't quite seem to sit right from the beginning. More importantly, though, my unease primed me to take note over the years of little clues here and there that all was not so neat and tidy in the annals of prehistory. Back in the 1990s, paleontologists discovered the remains of a prehistoric village in France. The skeletons of its last residents revealed the bones of us and Neanderthal people, evidently living together. In an instant, our story changed. Neanderthals were people. They were part of us. Accordingly, artists in forensic facial reconstruction were given the task of rethinking how our Neanderthal ancestors may have looked. So it was that one Friday morning, as I flicked through the pages of the London Times, I came across a picture of a Neanderthal man, looking considerably less apish than he had when I was a boy. He still had a low forehead with a heavy brow. He still had a heavy jaw and funny, close-sitting hair, and was altogether not quite as tall and handsome as you or me, but he was definitely a person. This makeover was such a change in the story of the universe that the Neanderthal's image stuck in my mind. I wondered if we might find evidence that Neanderthal people had not all died of cold and loneliness in the mountains after all. Perhaps we had simply all interbred, and their distinctives are still there in the great melting pot of our DNA. The following week, I took a train up to Leicester to visit a friend of mine studying for his PhD. After lunch on the first day, he challenged me to a game of pool in the college games room. First, we had to wait for the university's reigning pool champion to finish his game. He was from Macedonia and a fellow PhD student. When he stood up and looked at me, I couldn't believe it. It was the guy out of the picture in the London Times from the previous Friday. Spitting image. Same forehead, brow, chin, hair, and slight stoop. A PhD student and pool master. It was a weird moment, and I know it doesn't count for much in the great scheme of things, but it blew my prejudices open concerning our Neanderthal heritage and paleontological and DNA findings over the next couple of decades, underlining the reality of a far more diverse human population in ancient times. Say that 3 times. Breeding among Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens has now been demonstrated in the DNA record a number of times over. And then we found Otzi. Otzi was gradually thawing in a melting glacier in the Italian Trial. He was 5,000 years old, from a time when, according to my textbooks, he should have been shivering in a cave, wearing crude bearskins and going, ugh. This was not that. Otzi was wearing well-fitting clothing with a range of stitchwork, different textiles, and insulation for his clothing and shoes. He had shaved. He had fixed his teeth. He had a pouch of carefully crafted utilities. He was us. Otzi the Iceman's sophistication actually reinforced one aspect, what was said in the textbook I quoted from earlier. We arrived all of a sudden. Already clever. Already technologically minded. How do we explain that? Then again, all of a sudden, somewhere in ancient Sumeria, from out of nowhere, we find a familiar package of phenomena. Farming, irrigation, city streetscapes, canals, sanitation, writing, math, banking, astronomy, and timekeeping. And then, all of a sudden, these things sprang up all around the world. The artwork and artifacts of these new societies paint a strange picture indeed. A panoply of beings, small and large, human and hybrid, all pointing to a far older and far more complex story of beginnings for the human race. The more we study human beings, the more interesting and mysterious our beginnings become. What we are now unearthing, and what a new era of DNA testing seems to confirm, matches the folklore of many indigenous cultures, namely that human beings come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and that in time past, the diversity was even greater. Perhaps the hobbits, trolls, hairy people, little people, and giants of legend are more empirical than we give them credit for. Take giants, for instance. Every student of Latin is familiar with the writer Pliny. He was the governor of Bithynia in the early 100th century AD and kept up a correspondence with Trajan, the Roman emperor. A correspondence bequeathed for the generations of Latin scholars to pore over from that day to this. His letters include questions to the emperor concerning how Christians should be dealt with. He also refers in passing to a giant of 9 feet 9 inches, or 2.9 meters in height, who was brought to Rome from Arabia, where he was feted as a demigod. Pliny's near contemporary, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, also makes a passing reference to the flesh and bone reality of giant human beings. Josephus is known to many Christian readers on account of his historic reference to Jesus as being the Messiah and his description of the followers of Jesus being defined by their belief in his resurrection from the dead. In his commentary on Jewish history, Josephus makes references to the giants of the biblical narratives, the Nephilim, Emites, Gittites, Anakites, and Rephaites. References appear in Genesis, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Joshua, 1 Chronicles, 2 Samuel, and Amos. Goliath the Gittite had a height of 9 feet 9 inches, or 2.97 meters. Og the Rephite, who was king of Bashan, was reported as having a bed that measured 13.5 feet by 6 feet, or 4.1 meters by 1.8 meters. Josephus traces these people groups back to the references in Genesis 6 to the offspring of powerful ones whom he describes as fallen angels and human females. Josephus was writing as an historian, and so it is interesting to note the questions that he makes in his references. Josephus also references the following accounts from the Jewish history. Quote, a giant named Ishbi-Benob, who was carrying a bronze spear that weighed about 3.5 kilograms, and who was wearing a new sword, thought he could kill David. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to David's help, attacked the man, and killed him. 2 Samuel 21, verses 16 through 17a. Quote, another battle took place at Gath, where there was a giant with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. He was a descendant of the ancient giants. He defied the Israelites, and Jonathan, the son of David's brother, Shammah, killed him. Those who were killed by David and his men were descendants of the giants at Gath. End quote. 1 Chronicles 25 through 8. In his retelling of the story, Josephus attributes the height of 8 feet, or 2.75 meters, to the giant victim of David's nephew Jonathan. Referring to a battle in Joshua's time, he says, quote, at that time there were still giants whose bodies were so large and whose faces were so different to normal people that they were shocking to look at and struck terror when you heard them. The bones of these men are still on display to this very day. End quote. What is interesting is that Josephus draws a direct connection between the Greek mythologies of hybrids and those of the Genesis 6 reference. Don't miss the fact that Josephus regarded these mythological references as memories of history rather than as fiction. In his mind, he is confirming the fact of the matter by pointing to the skeletal remains, quote-unquote, on display at the time of his writing. Archaeological finds in more recent times have uncovered skeletal remains of a similar height to the giant victim of King David's nephew. The odd detail of a giant with 6 fingers and toes finds a curious echo in a 19th century find in Noble Country, Ohio, where the skeletal remains were found of 8 feet, 2.45 meter tall humans, or hominids, with 6 fingers and toes and a jaw where all the teeth, front and back, were molars. These kinds of anomalous finds are ranged from Ecuador to Malta and are often in places where local folklore holds memories of oversized people from times past. At the other end of the spectrum, excavations in Indonesia in 2004 brought to life some other human-like beings who had previously been regarded as purely fictional. These were the hobbits of Indonesia. The initial find was made by a team of Australian and Indonesian scientists who were excavating the Lingbuka cave on the island of Flores in Indonesia. The 1-meter-tall skeletal remains were named Homo floresiensis in honor of their location, but the world quickly preferred the name out of the J.R.R. Tolkien tales of The Hobbit. This was in honor of the newfound hominids' small stature and enormous feet. What was especially surprising about the find was that these little people appear to have been living in Flores as recently as 18,000 years ago. With finds like these, we have to concede that the prehistory of humanity would appear to be rather more diverse and a lot more complicated than the single line of gradual evolution that you and I may have learned at school. Even today, human beings are so diverse that we are not even a single breeding group. Rhesus and non-rhesus blood means that humans fall into at least two breeding groups. And a breeding group is one definition of a species. Looking to our ancestors, we now know of Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalis, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo denisova, Homo floresiensis, Homo paracus, and presumably Homo nobilis. That's my name for the molar teeth guy from Noble County. If we include Homo gethenus from 1 Chronicles 20, then we have people ranging from low skulls to long skulls, hobbits to giants. Knowing this, one might question the generally accepted interpretation of ancient wall carvings showing people our size sometimes working alongside and sometimes serving much larger people. The often repeated interpretation sees these differences in scale as a bit of artistic license to convey varying degrees of social stature. Yet, perhaps what the Bible recalls in print, these wall paintings and carvings are recalling in art, namely that humanity was once an even more diverse population than it is today. For me, the intriguing question surrounding the long-skulled people is about why other people groups would go to such drastic lengths to alter the skull shape of their babies to look more like the long skulls. We are naturally and instinctively powerfully protective of our babies' heads. Why would entire people groups around the world deliberately deform their babies' heads to resemble another niche population? A hint is to be found in the annals of the Spanish conquistadors in Central and South America. They were careful to wipe out the long-skulled people as they were recognized as royalty among the indigenous people. Curiously, this parallels the images of Egyptian social strata during the period of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamun. The servant class is represented as people with more familiar shaped skulls. The pharaohs, by contrast, have headgear that accentuates or imitates the long paracus-shaped skull. It's an unexplained association that even finds its echo in modern times with the Audrey Hepburn bun, bespeaking elegance and sophistication. We can only conjecture as to why this shape of skull was associated with nobility or social superiority. It could be that the low skull and heavy brow of our Neanderthal cousins were regarded as signs of social inferiority, and that a higher social value was placed on higher foreheads. It might be that with 25% larger brains, long-skulled people may have enjoyed some intellectual advantages. But given the tiny populations of long-skulled peoples, the question remains, who have we all been trying to look like? When the paracus skulls hit the limelight again in recent years, some observers wondered if there might be non-human DNA in the long-skulled people to explain both their unusually shaped heads and the social advantage that seemed to come with that head shape. To date, the DNA testing confirms our paracus cousins are entirely human, a mix of indigenous South American, Western Asian, and Eastern Europe. They are another example of ancient human diversity. Once we begin to see a bigger human family, we are forced to revisit the question of just how ancient are we? As family with Homo neanderthalis, how far back do we go? And therefore, how far back does human memory go? If you look for evidence of agriculture and civilization, you might go back to 10,000 BC, with the advent of farming in cities. If you look for tool making and evidence of cultural practices such as art, craft, and ritual practices, then you might reach 20,000 BC. Look for people of our exact design and build, and you will reach something like 200,000 BC. Some researchers point to evidence of construction in South Africa from that earliest of time frames. If we prospect for the earliest use of fire, then current consensus puts us in Africa anywhere in the region of 400,000 to 1.4 million years ago. and in the company of Homo erectus. So just how long have we been here, and how many human civilizations have come and gone in that time? And what happens if we take that question to the Bible? If you read the Bible with a fundamentalist hermeneutic, then the genealogies will take you back to about 4000 BC. Reality, though, may be more complex. Even with the fundamentalist reading, we must take into account that in the pages of Genesis 1 through 11, we have a collation of scrolls collected from plural sources. Then, at some point during or after the time of Moses, the scrolls have been redacted to form the single work we know today. However, the separate identity of the scrolls remains so clear that the literary glue can still be seen as we transition from one scroll to the next. So it is easy to see that the different narratives could stand on their own as they originally did. Viewed that way, it is possible that as well as the two creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2, and the two flood accounts of Genesis 6 through 9, we have also two accounts of the extinction of a culture, one caused by the deluge in Genesis 6 through 9, and one by other means in Genesis 11. Each time humanity is taken back to a more primitive existence. Each time the catastrophes result in human migrations, loss of language, and loss of technology. Put simply, our Genesis scrolls raise the same question as our paleontological explorations, namely, how long have we been here, and how far back does human memory go? How many civilizations have come and gone? How many times might our species have interacted with other extraterrestrial species? How many cataclysms and reboots of history are buried in our collective unconsciousness? There is one near extinction level event, or ELE, that sits uncontroversially within the timeline of Homo sapiens. Though I was taught about it at school and have drawn pictures of the megafauna rendered extinct by the drama of it, I don't think I had ever realized how close to extinction humanity really came. Nor did I ever read Genesis 1 in the light of it. I had long known that the last ice age was a challenging chapter for human beings and beasts alike. I knew of the flash freezing that caused the extinction of saber-toothed tigers, mammoths, and woolly rhinos, a process dramatized graphically in the movie The Day After Tomorrow, one of my favorites. But just at that moment of fragility, as if the climactic challenges of the Ice Age weren't enough of a setback, the planet suffered an enormous impact. Somewhere around 12,800 years ago, just around the time several ancient civilizations appear to have been instantly vacated, the 2-mile-deep ice shelf that covered North America and much of northern Europe was impacted by a force so catastrophic that sky fires destroyed cities around the globe. Floods submerged entire city-states. An estimated 75% of North America's megafauna was obliterated, and humanity itself came within a hair's breadth of disappearing from the face of the earth. This was our encounter with the Clovis Comet, an encounter so world-shattering that planet Earth would never be the same again. Understanding its aftermath offers us a glimpse of how our ancestors may have interpreted Clovis and all other previous cataclysms and recoveries. Though I had only ever read Genesis as a creation account, understanding the Clovis event made me consider for the first time that what we have in the pages of Genesis 1 may be not a creation account at all, but a story of recovery. And that is the end of chapter 5. Peace and blessings to you all.